According to legend, a hero doesn't become a true hero until the moment of their perfectly timed death. In ancient mythology, it was thought that heroes existed out of time. They were too rare, too bright, too impossible to exist in the world they were born into. And it wasn't until a single destiny-soaked moment where their story was elevated to mythology. And of course, that moment is their death. The Greeks even had a goddess for this whole concept, Hera, who is the goddess of perfect timing. Not fate, timing. It was Hera who ruled over these heroes, which is where we get the word, and helped transform their stories from just a mere story into that of myth. In our modern world, we don't really have heroes anymore, but we do have something that is very similar. The superstar. Superstars aren't celebrities. They're mythic beings. They're symbols where we as a society project our collective longing and also our collective cruelty. And all true superstars follow the same four-part arc. They have a wounded childhood, a meteoric ascent, a moment where they transform from mere human into a symbol, and a perfectly timed fall that seals their fate and makes them immortal. So in this video, we are going to be talking about superstars, tracing them back from the very first one that I can identify up into the modern day, and talking about what makes a superstar, what makes them so rare, and why we keep seeing this story play out over and over and over. But before we get into all of that, hi, my name is Kate and I am an astrologer, I am a pop culture enthusiast, and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive show about the world of Andy Warhol, the events that led to his attempted assassination, and superstars, and this whole superstar concept. And on this channel, I occasionally do a thing that I think this video falls into, which is Everything Stars, a show where we talk about stars in the sky, stars on the screen, mythology, pop culture, and all of those kinds of things. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be breaking down superstars, and I can't wait to get into it, so let's just do it. Okay. So first things first, obviously I have to address that I am dressed as Hedy Lamarr. I wore this costume on Halloween and I thought that it was perfectly themed for this video, so that is why I am dressed like this. Okay, so let's get into it. So before we start breaking down each individual superstar, I want to first identify the four pillars that, according to me, make someone a superstar. The first pillar is the initiation wound. And this basically is that every superstar begins their life with a fractured childhood in some way. And this wound is so deep that it splits the self into the public self and the private self before the child's identity has formed. And this creates very porous boundaries in the child and prevents their identity from fully forming together. And this wounding can occur in many different ways. It could be an abandonment or early death of a parent, emotional neglect or instability in the home, being sexualized or adultified too early, being turned into a performer before they know who they are, exploitation by adults in general, intense pressure to be special or perfect, or an environment where love is conditional. And all of these things can happen together, only some of them can happen, but in general, whether or not the child is a child star or not, their childhood does involve something like this to some degree. So a lot of superstars are child stars, but not all. And important distinction, not all child stars become superstars. We are talking about a very rare breed of person. And why this wound is so important is because the initial wound kind of creates this mirror child. And so this kind of child becomes hyper attuned to the emotions and the desires of people around them. They learn to perform a version of themselves that gets love. They become very magnetic and their identity is very fluid, and they confuse attention with affection, and they become a perfect vessel for projection because of these porous boundaries. And in addition to all of that, this wound produces like a disassociation effect in the child that ends up reading as charisma. So this child who learns to leave themselves, who learns to disassociate, becomes hypnotic to watch on camera. And they appear like luminous and dreamy and otherworldly, and they channel emotion in a way that feels supernatural. And I also would argue that they have a desperation to be loved that we as the audience pick up on. It's something that you see just in their eyes. And because they look so desperate to be loved in this like intense, deep way, we almost subconsciously as an audience connect with them. That is my personal theory. That is what I think. And so this wound, as I was just kind of mentioning, creates this openness and emptiness in the child that the culture that can then pour their desires into. And the superstar becomes a symbol. They become a projection or a mirror of the culture, and they usually reflect back the culture in some profound way. So as we go through all of the superstars, we'll start to see how each one kind of symbolizes a slightly different archetype in the culture that is reflective of the moment that they live in. And then of course, this early wounding sets up the tragedy from the start. And because the superstar can never maintain the projection, their fall is then inevitable. And it's kind of a blown up version of their original wounding, because the public adoration kind of reenacts the initial violation that they had in childhood, and the boundaryless state that they exist in is impossible to maintain, so it becomes the reason for the eventual collapse. So as we move forward, I want to kind of lay that out so we can understand together that we're talking about the superstar as an archetype. So I don't want to necessarily speculate about each person's individual childhood trauma, although we will discuss some of them. But I think we just need to know from the jump that that's where all of these people are starting from. And then the other pillars are the meteoric ascent, which is that it's somewhat of an overnight success for all of these people, or a rise that feels just very inevitable or kind of fated in a way. And then we enter the third pillar, which is the moment that the person becomes a symbol and is no longer a human. And then of course, the perfectly timed collapse. That is the fourth pillar. And in a lot of cases, that means a literal death, but not all. Some of them are a dramatic fall from grace, and we will talk about that. So, with those pillars established, let's start talking about the superstars. Okay, so the first person we are going to talk about is Jean Eagles. And if you have not heard of Jean Eagles, I am not surprised, because she isn't officially a superstar, but I wanted to include her because I think she is like the proto superstar. Jean Eagles was born June 26th, 1890, and she was born in Kansas City, Missouri. And in her early life, she is traveling around the United States in like early 1910 as a performer with a traveling circus. And she's also on the vaudeville circuit. She's a dancer. And then as she's working in the circus, she moves her way up to like bigger roles. And by 1911, she moves to New York City to try and make it as like a Broadway showgirl type person. And so she finds work doing reviews, and she naturally has like kind of mousy brown hair, but she bleaches it blonde, and that really helps her stand out. And so we start to see like the early seeds of what would make somebody a superstar. But we don't have the superstar culture yet. We don't really have television. We barely have radio. So being a vaudeville star is like kind of as much of a star as somebody could be in 1911. In 1916, Jean Eagles is featured in the Ziegfeld Follies as a Ziegfeld girl, and that is kind of like her big break as far as her career. Not long after that, in 1970, she's cast on Broadway in the role of Maria Reynolds in Hamilton, which is not the Hamilton that we know and love today by Lin-Manuel Miranda. There actually was a play called Hamilton about the life of Hamilton in 1917. So, and it was written by a woman. Fun fact. It was written by like this socialite who said that, or maybe socialite is the wrong word. She was like a wealthy housewife, a New York City society lady who said that playwriting was her secret passion. And she wrote Hamilton and it went to Broadway and it was like widely celebrated. And Jean Eagles is Maria Reynolds, who is the woman that Hamilton cheats on his wife with. So kind of already in like a superstar kind of role. You know what I mean? And then on November 7th, 1922, Jean Eagles makes her Broadway debut in the show Rain. I actually have a whole video on Rain because I think this play is fascinating and many women in Hollywood played this role. So if you want to check out that story, I encourage you to do that. But Rain is basically the story of this prostitute named Sadie who is shipwrecked on an island in the Pacific with this pastor named Mr. Davidson, and I don't want to spoil it, but they have words. They do not like each other. It's a very modern story. It's kind of about like women's sexuality and how they are punished for being free and all of these very modern themes. So Jean Eagles stars in Rain and it catapults her into superstardom. Between 1923 and 1924, Jean Eagles tours the United States with Rain, and she's a sensation. But during this tour, she develops and maintains a pretty bad heroin addiction. In the fall of 1926, she returns to Broadway for Rain's farewell performance, and then by December, she is cast as Roxy Hart in Chicago. No, not that Chicago, a different version of Chicago, the play that the musical is based on. And she's cast because she's like the biggest star of the time, but she's kind of having like a mental health breakdown and she's very difficult to work with and she's demanding and she's a diva. She demands the director be replaced and they replace him and then she still doesn't want to work on the show. So she eventually leaves the production and never debuts on stage officially as Roxy Hart. The role ends up going to somebody else. And then just a year or two after that, Jean Eagles, age 39, collapses at a Park Avenue hospital, and she was there for an already scheduled appointment but ends up collapsing and passing away, and her death is attributed afterwards to alcoholic psychosis. So I wanted to mention Jean Eagles. I don't think she officially qualifies as a superstar according to our rubric, but I feel like she was at the first star that was kind of percolating in the public imagination as this archetype. She was a troubled young woman who had this meteoric rise and then a dramatic fall off, and yes. Oh, I also wanted to say that Jean Eagles had her funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel, which I have a video about that you should check out. Having your funeral at Frank E. Campbell's is not a necessity for being a superstar, but as you will note, a lot of them do. So just something fun to note, and we are going to move on to our first real superstar, in my opinion, which is Rudolph Valentino. So Valentino was born in Italy. His father died when he was very young, so that kind of is his early childhood abandonment wound. And he rejected traditional paths. He bounced between a lot of odd jobs and kind of had a sense of displacement. He was an immigrant, and so he kind of had this immigrant identity in Hollywood, which gave him kind of an outsider feel. And there was a constant criticism of his masculinity. The public kind of fixated on his desirability, and that was both like his selling point, but also why a lot of people had a problem with him. which is something I feel like we will see over and over with these superstars. People having a problem with them kind of just for existing. So even though he wasn't a child performer, he did have that mythic wound of early loss, insecurity, longing for belonging himself, and his sensitivity kind of being weaponized by the culture. And then he has a very fast ascent. He has his breakout role in The Four Horsemen in 1921, and he becomes this overnight transformation into the romantic ideal of the 1920s. He had an extreme level of fixation for his female audiences, and there were like literal riots and fainting, mass hysteria when Valentino was around. And his sudden, like, skyrocketing fame outpaced Hollywood's ability to control the narrative with Valentino. And he basically becomes the first sex symbol for women in Hollywood. Then we have the moment where Valentino ceases to become a human and becomes a symbol. And I would say that happens with the Chic. So through Valentino, the ideal of masculinity for the 1920s is reflected as a masculinity that is sensual and exotic, emotional, and kind of feminine by 1920 standards. And his image shaped fashion and dance and desire and literally changed what women found attractive. And he caused national debates about gender norms, and there was a fan culture around him that was insane. And then we have the dramatic fall. So in 1926, something occurred that was called the pink powder puff controversy. And so basically, the public criticism around Valentino was that he was responsible for the feminization of America's men. And his critics argued that he was too beautiful, too sensual, too feminine, too polished, and too adored by women. So therefore, he was destroying masculinity. It's so funny to see like the same arguments way back in the day. People worrying about traditional masculinity and femininity. So this whole scandal starts because there was a public restroom in Chicago that installed an automatic dispenser for pink face powder, which was like a grooming amenity. And a columnist wrote an article about this, and they basically flipped out and wrote an editorial blaming Valentino personally for this horrifying like feminization of America's men. And basically the argument was men are using beauty products and Valentino is turning America's men into sissies because now men want to use face powder. So it was kind of both misogynistic and xenophobic because the attacks were both on his Italian identity and his beauty and his appeal to women and the fact that he was kind of non-masculine. And Valentino took it really personally. He was devastated by this column. And it kind of hit at his core wounds. It hit at his sensitivity, at his Italian heritage, his feeling of being an outsider, and his insecurity around not fitting in as the traditional American male. And he was constantly being mocked by men, partly because, or in large part because, women were so obsessed with him that men were jealous. But Valentino was very sensitive and just took it really hard. So this article, speaking of timing, the article is kind of the catalyst in a lot of ways, like for his very sudden public death. So the article runs on August 18th, 1926. 3 days earlier, on August 15th, Valentino had collapsed and was diagnosed with a ruptured ulcer. Maybe because of all the stress he was under being attacked all the time. And then he died on August 23rd, just a week after the article was published. And so the article and controversy of the pink powder puff scandal and his sudden death are linked together. And the public outcry when Valentino died was insane. There was like mass hysteria at his funeral, which was held at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. So this was kind of like the first real superstar mass effect moment in American culture. Valentino's death and the hysteria around it. All right, so if Gene Eagles was the prototype and Valentino was like the first mass superstar event, Judy Garland, I would argue, is the superstar proof of concept. The moment, the person in which the superstar archetype is truly formed in our public consciousness. So I also have a video about Judy Garland if you want her whole life story, but very briefly, Judy Garland was born into a vaudeville family, so she has been singing and performing literally since she could walk and talk. MGM signs her at 13, and she is immediately put on the pill system, so she's taking uppers to get her going in the morning because the call times are so early, and then she's so wired from being on uppers all day, she can't fall asleep. They put her on downers at night so she can go to bed, and then she just starts again the next day. So she's put on this cycle of drugs, uppers and downers, really, really early. There was constant criticism of her looks. She was told that she was too fat, that she wasn't pretty enough, and so that gets into her psyche, as it would anyone. And then she's kind of indoctrinated very early into perfectionism and self-doubt and dependency on studio control. So her childhood is essentially erased. I would say Judy Garland is probably like the quintessential child star. So then Judy Garland experiences her fast ascent. She already was in a number of movies, but in 1939, she stars in The Wizard of Oz, and that becomes a cultural phenomenon. And currently in this day and age, we have Wicked, which is a cultural phenomenon. So that story still has kind of like a stranglehold on us as a collective. And so she becomes the American face of like innocence and emotional sincerity, especially during World War II, when the public kind of like needed innocence and sincerity. Like she was, as I mentioned earlier, kind of like a reflection of what was needed at that moment in time. And the studio, MGM, keeps her working nonstop. So her ascent is directly tied to her exploitation. And her fame kind of fuses with her own survival. At that same moment, I would argue, is her becoming a cultural symbol. Judy becomes Dorothy, and she becomes the emotional barometer for America during and after World War II. So she is seen as like fragile, but also strong and resilient, and her vulnerability becomes very iconic. And her voice, which is kind of what she's known for, becomes representative of longing and hope and endurance during a really difficult period in American history. And audiences, because she was so young when she came out and she is Dorothy, and they have this emotional connection to her, they feel like very personally invested in her as a person and as a symbol. And she really becomes kind of like the template for the wounded, luminous superstar. Of course, her fall comes a little bit after. It was not as immediate as Valentino, but she begins to break down in adulthood. The brutal studio environment makes her somebody who is not really able to live outside of the studio environment, and she really struggles to be an independent adult. She struggles with addiction for the rest of her life, and financial instability, custody battles, pressure to perform, and the public watches her unravel as she goes through adulthood. And she has to perform not because she wants to, but because she like financially needs to. Judy Garland dies at age 47 of an accidental overdose, which is her kind of official fall, but in true Hera timing, her death is a cultural touchstone. One, of course, just because she dies very young and it's tragic and the public reacts to that, but the very next day, after Judy dies, Judy was an LGBTQ icon. She was an icon for many gay men growing up, especially during that era. And a lot of men, gay men, and lesbians and trans women and all sorts of people on the queer spectrum were at the Stonewall Inn mourning her death when the police raided Stonewall. The police had raided Stonewall many times, but it wasn't until this instant when the community, the queer community, felt like they had lost one of their own and they were in mourning, that when the police came, they were like, not today. This is not the time to raid this bar. Judy has died. And that sparked a rage in them that led to the Stonewall riots. And that was a real turning point for LGBTQ history. So Judy is quintessentially a superstar. She hits all of the 4 pillars: early childhood wounding, meteoric ascent, moment she turns into a symbol from a human, and a death that is perfectly timed. So we are going to say that Judy Garland is probably the first true superstar in American culture. Moving right along. Okay, now we are going to talk about James Dean. James Dean was born in 1931 in Indiana, and he had an early, intense attachment to his mother. And then when James is 9 years old, his mother dies. So we have a devastating, formative trauma for James. I will also say there have been rumors, and different biographers have talked about James telling Elizabeth Taylor that he experienced abuse from a priest in his childhood. That is unsubstantiated or unconfirmed, I guess, but I did want to kind of point that out, that there's also that element. So even though he wasn't a child star like Judy, he did experience some early childhood traumatic stuff around identity with this loss, and then also with this potential abuse. And after his mom dies, he is sent to live with an aunt and uncle. So he has a sense of displacement and kind of like an emotional exile that he experiences very early on. And he's very sensitive and artistic and introspective from a very young age. He felt misunderstood, and he really struggled with masculinity and the expectations that he felt people had of him in this really conservative environment that he was raised in. So his early childhood superstar wounding is really about abandonment and loss, I would say, as well as this potential abuse that does have a significant effect on your identity as a person. Then James moves to New York City and he becomes an actor, and he's raw and electric and magnetic. And he experiences, of course, a very fast ascent. His first big role is in East of Eden, which immediately creates like media industry buzz. And then his overnight cultural phenomenon sensation moment is Rebel Without a Cause, which even if you haven't seen Rebel Without a Cause, I feel like you know the image of James Dean in the leather jacket and the blue jeans and the white t-shirt. And I would argue that this moment is both his ascent and him turning from mere human into a symbol. He is the quintessential rebel, the bad boy in media. So fame comes extremely fast, and he goes from being a nobody to being a generational symbol in less than a year. And his emotional intensity really becomes his brand. So the cultural impact of James is that he embodied this 1950s youth rebellion archetype before it even had a name. And he defines his masculinity through sensitivity and vulnerability and angst. And he's also a style icon, as I mentioned. And he resonates really deeply with disaffected youth and becomes kind of a mirror to what the youth in the 1950s felt like. And even though he only starred in 3 films, he becomes one of the most recognizable film stars of that whole era. And then, of course, we have the fall. So leading up to the fall moment, we have James Dean expressing more and more reckless behavior and emotional volatility. And so his early wounding is beginning to show, and Hollywood executives were starting to see him as difficult and too intense and uncontrollable. And there was also a public fascination with his danger and his beauty that was creating a real pressure cooker around him. And his persona was basically becoming too big for him to manage and control. So this is kind of like the precursor to the fall that every superstar does experience, where like the fame is becoming too heavy. And his perfectly timed moment of immortality comes on September 30th, 1955, when he's only 24, and he dies in a car crash. He's driving himself uncontrollably, and it's sudden and violent and cinematic, and it's a very Hera-timed death. And the death occurs when he's super young. He's only 24, and so there's no career decline, there's no humiliation, no overexposure, and he's frozen forever as this icon of youth. And it was a massive cultural shock. People felt like they had lost the future itself. And his legend grows exponentially after his death. So it kind of like seals his fate. And he becomes this like eternal archetype of the doomed, angry young man. So I would say that James Dean is probably the most pure male superstar archetype. But there's some other people on the list that maybe could take that crown. So let's move on to probably the most superstar of all superstars, Marilyn Monroe. All right, let's break down the 4 superstar pillars for Marilyn Monroe because I think she fits them perfectly. So Marilyn is born Norma Jean. Her father is unknown, her mother is institutionalized, and she spends her early childhood bouncing around from foster homes and orphanages, and her early life just in general is marked by instability. So she has a deep, chronic abandonment wound. Marilyn also experiences documented early childhood sexual abuse, and her early sexualization and lack of safety and just the general instability of her life creates lifelong disassociation in her. So she learns really early on that beauty is both like a blessing and a currency, and also a curse and a danger. And her identity is fractured really, really early on, which kind of plants the seeds for the Marilyn Monroe persona to grow. Then she experiences her meteoric ascent. She is discovered working in a factory during World War II and kind of has like instant modeling success. I mean, she doesn't like blow up overnight, but she's starting to build a career for herself in Hollywood as an actress and a model. And she starts getting bit parts in Hollywood, and the audience fascination with her is almost immediate. Even when she doesn't have big roles, everyone's eye is always drawn to Marilyn. Her magnetism is not really about acting. It wasn't that she was this amazing actress, it was just this pure magnetism that she emanated from the screen. She glowed. And really, as we've discussed, it's kind of her disassociation and her vulnerability that we as an audience see and latch onto. So her ascent is rapid, and she quickly becomes the blonde bombshell. And Marilyn becomes a global superstar, and she transcends film. She becomes an image, an icon, a fantasy. She's almost like a metaphor of a person, more than a human being. As she progresses through her life, her struggles with mental health and addiction become more and more apparent. She's taking pills to go to sleep and pills to wake up, very similar to Judy. And she starts to have public meltdowns. She's fired from sets. She can't show up to work on time. There's a lot of rumors about her and gossip, and people write things in the magazines, and kind of just a general state of public humiliation. As her psyche is giving out in her late 30s, the public is starting to turn on her, and then she happens to die at age 36 of mysterious circumstances. She overdoses, but it's never been totally clear whether it was an accidental overdose or a suicide, and this like murkiness around her death kind of like becomes part of her mythology. And the timing of being 36 and like almost too old, but not quite, still young and beautiful, but becoming kind of this tragic figure, cements her into a myth. So the timing of her death freezes her into this tragic, luminous icon, and in some ways, she becomes more real after her death, when she becomes a myth, than she ever was in real life. And after she dies, her popularity skyrockets, and I would say has remained at that level ever since. Even now, like over 60 years later, Marilyn Monroe is still a part of our public imagination. And Andy Warhol, of course, used her image in his famous paintings, kind of helping cement her legacy. But Marilyn Monroe is as big a star as she ever was. So Marilyn Monroe, I think, is probably quintessential superstar, the apex superstar. We are now taking a slight detour into Warhol land, my home turf, to talk about Edie Sedgwick. Edie Sedgwick was born to an extremely wealthy family, kind of like an American aristocracy kind of family. Her family was from New England, but she moved to California with her family when she was a very young girl, and she grew up kind of isolated on this ranch owned by her family. She was the youngest of many siblings, and her parents were super weird. Her dad was this crazy narcissist who insisted that they were like special, beautiful people that were not like normal humans. They were beyond. They were the Sedgwicks. The Sedgwick family actually had this burial plot called the Sedgwick Pie, where all of their ancestors, going back to like early colonial type people, the Sedgwicks were always prominent in America, going back to like literally the foundation of the country. And so all of these Sedgwicks are buried in the Sedgwick Pie, and they're buried in a circle with their feet like facing the center. And the idea is that on Judgment Day, when everyone like rises from the dead, the Sedgwicks will rise up and they will be only facing each other. That is their dream, to only be with Sedgwicks. So her family is super wealthy, super weird, and she grows up very isolated, is essentially homeschooled, and is only with her family, living in this kind of like fantasy world where she rides horses and has nannies and like all the trappings of wealth. And she also has very well-documented childhood sexual abuse from her father. Her father is a piece of work, and you can watch my Edie Sedgwick video if you want to learn the whole story. But long story short, when Edie is really young, she walks in on her father cheating on her mom with one of his mistresses, and he immediately slaps her, tells her that she's insane, says, "You don't know what you're seeing, you're imagining this, you're crazy," calls a doctor to the house that night, and the doctor sedates her, and they basically tell her that she's crazy and that she didn't see what she saw. And this is an extreme early childhood wound, and it kicks off really early struggles for Edie with her mental health, and she develops an eating disorder, and she starts acting out, and like kind of like very classic tale of early childhood wounding, as we've been discussing. So, and then Edie, she grows up, she's actually hospitalized a number of times for her eating disorder and her mental health, and eating disorders in the 1960s were not widely recognized. I don't even think they had a word for it at that point, but they knew something was wrong with her. And so she really struggles throughout her childhood, but of course she is stunningly beautiful and wealthy, and she goes to Harvard after she graduates high school, or I don't even think she went to a real high school, but she goes to Harvard, and when she turns 18, I believe, she comes into a trust from her grandmother, and she suddenly has like all this money. She decides that she doesn't care about Harvard anymore, and she moves to New York City, and almost immediately she is a hit in New York. She falls into the Warhol scene, and Andy Warhol immediately makes her one of his superstars. And that really is the moment that the word superstar kind of enters the lexicon in a big way. So Edie is in Andy Warhol's films, and these are like art house weirdo films. So the majority of people didn't see these films in the 1960s, but her image becomes very iconic, and she's featured in a Vogue profile where she is in this black leotard, and she has her chandelier earrings, and she kind of like is the prototype for this 1960s it girl look that Twiggy also embodies. And the Vogue article about her calls her a youth Quaker, and they kind of identify her as like the symbolic image of like 1960s counterculture. So Edie is important. She's not quite a superstar on the level of Marilyn Monroe, but I wanted to include her because I think she's the first influencer, essentially. She's the first person that was really famous for being famous, famous for her image, as opposed to famous for having a body of work. She wasn't really an actress. She just was famous for being famous. So she is kind of where like the superstar and the it girl cross over. And I think I'm gonna make a series of videos about these archetypes. So we'll probably make an it girl video because the it girl and the superstar are two distinctly different archetypes. But Edie I wanted to include because I do think she fits a lot of the pillars. So she has this meteoric rise. She arrives in New York. She's Andy Warhol superstar. She's in Vogue. And then after spending like only a year or so in the factory scene, she dates Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan gets married. It's not to Edie. Edie is really upset about it. She kind of falls apart. She has a big fight with Andy. She leaves the factory and she ends up going back to California, but she's developed a very bad drug habit at this point. And so she's in California, she gets married, but she never can like totally get her life together. And at age 28, she dies of an accidental overdose. And so she hits all the pillars. She has the early childhood wounding. She has the fast ascent. She does kind of have a moment where her image becomes a symbol, even though it's not on the same scale as Marilyn, but she is symbolic of an era and an identity and a youth culture. And then she has a tragic downfall and an early death. So I do think she hits all the pillars, even if she's not like as big as Marilyn. But honestly, who is as big as Marilyn? Actually, the next person on our list kind of is as big as Marilyn, and that is Elvis Presley. The king of rock and roll. I actually went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to include Elvis because I think that Elvis actually kind of also embodies the rock star archetype, which I think is distinctly different from the superstar in the same way that the it girl is different from the superstar. But I do think Elvis also qualifies as a true superstar in a way that no other rock star really does. Although maybe Kurt Cobain also, I would say, falls into this category. I wasn't going to include him on the list, but I'm just thinking out loud right now. And I think maybe we could argue that Kurt Cobain is also a superstar. But back to Elvis. So, initiation wound. He's born into extreme poverty. He has chronic insecurity and shame around where he comes from. He had a stillborn twin named Jessie, so he kind of has this lifelong like survivor's wound and also kind of a sense of incompleteness that comes from losing his twin. And he has like deeply emotional enmeshment with his mother. So kind of like an early blurred boundaries situation that does manifest in his relationships later on with women. And he has early sexualization from performing in adult spaces and also always kind of just felt like an outsider, being a poor Southern kid with unusual beauty and sensitivity. So I would say like key wound themes for Elvis are fragmentation, loneliness, emotional hunger, and identity instability, which is the perfect superstar initiation energy. And then of course we have the meteoric rise. So he is discovered at Sun Records and is kind of an instant sensation. He has music talent plus beauty and charisma, and it's just like this cultural like phenomenon when Elvis hits the scene. And his TV appearances lead to like moral panic. People are outraged by his dancing and his hips and his pelvis and his moves and his style of music, which was black music that was being done by a white man. And so then there was all this kind of racist critiques for Elvis because he was performing black music, and women lose their minds. Very similar to Valentino, but now in a kind of a different package. So women love Elvis. Men are enraged about Elvis, probably because women are so obsessed with Elvis, and they are angry about it, and it's a whole thing. So he basically goes from being a truck driver to being a superstar within the span of 2 years. So very fast ascent for Elvis. And he quickly becomes like the symbol of youth culture, even more so than James Dean, because James Dean is like, you know, the angsty, tortured, deep, troubled youth. Elvis is youth culture, but in a more fun, exuberant, sexual way. That's just like not so sad in the way that James Dean was. It's a lot more fun and rowdy and rough and sexy. And he really becomes a cultural archetype. He transcends from mere mortal to being the king of rock and roll immediately. And then of course we get to the downfall. So he has a chronic pill dependency. His body and his psyche start to erode. He's isolated, he's lonely, he's controlled by the business machine that he created. His public appearance begins to degrade and he gains weight, and he kind of becomes this like grotesque, tragic figure. And the culture watches in slow motion as he falls with kind of like this mix of fascination and horror. Elvis famously dies at age 42 of heart failure and prescription drug complications, and his death is exactly late enough to capture the full arc, but early enough to preserve the myth. So when he dies, the culture reacts with shock, and the myth really explodes after his death, and he becomes this eternal, tragic king of rock and roll. I feel like Elvis and Marilyn are kind of this like yin and yang, the male and female version of the same archetype. Marilyn is like quintessential goddess kind of beauty, and Elvis is like quintessential male sexiness, masculinity, rock and roll, like the origin point for all male stars after him. As Elvis is experiencing his downfall, another superstar is on the rise, and that, of course, is none other than Michael Jackson. All right, Michael Jackson. Initiation wound. If you know anything about the Michael Jackson story, you know that his childhood was insane. So Michael Jackson is a child prodigy performing professionally by the age of 6. He is under extreme pressure, emotional and physical abuse from his father, violent rehearsals, perfectionism, essentially no childhood at all. And he experiences sexualization by the industry beginning at a very young age, and his identity is split very early on from Michael as the person and Michael the public persona and Michael Jackson the brand. So he really has fame before he even has his ego formation, which is a core superstar wound. And disassociation for him becomes a survival strategy, as it does with all of the superstars. But for Michael in particular, it ends up first reading as charisma and later in his life reading as like strangeness and weirdness. So we get to the meteoric ascent, which Michael experiences extremely young. Jackson 5 are an immediate international sensation, and as the youngest member, Michael, of course, is the breakout star. And he goes through his early life being in the Jackson 5, wildly famous, and then becomes even more famous when he starts his solo career. Off the Wall is like super successful, and then of course we have Thriller, which is a nuclear explosion when it comes to cultural impact. And Thriller becomes the best-selling album of all time, and he moonwalks at Motown 25, which is a cultural reset moment, and his ascent is just beyond meteoric. Like, there is nobody who has ever been as famous as Michael Jackson, and I doubt there will ever be anyone in the future who will be as famous as Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is singular in his fame. So he reaches the stage where he becomes kind of a cultural symbol in the 1980s, and he essentially defines culture in that era. He is the icon of MTV, music video storytelling, dance is image, and he's a universal symbol for everyone, children, adults, every demographic, every country, all around the world. And he becomes like, a global image. His silhouette, his moves, his fedora, his glove, like his shoes, the socks, everything about him is a symbol. He's no longer a person. He is a myth. He is an archetype. He is a brand. And I think probably Michael Jackson is the closest thing that we will ever experience as like a demigod in our popular culture. And then of course we get to the fall. So as he ages, he becomes weirder and weirder. He has more and more plastic surgery. He has more accusations of inappropriateness with children. And it's all starting to fall apart. Tabloids are out of control. There's a media circus around him at all times. And the public fascination turns from like public love to kind of a public hunger for his freakishness. And so the same people that once worshipped him begin to devour him. After years of isolation and medication and reclusiveness, Michael Jackson passes away of essentially an accidental overdose administered to him by members of his staff. And when he dies at age 50, the world goes into like a planetary mourning period. And his death is quintessential Hera timing. It happens late enough that he is able to achieve like peak myth, but young enough that he's able to preserve the mythic status and the tragedy without ever becoming truly old. And it happens early enough that we haven't had the chance to hold him accountable for all of the horrific things that he has allegedly done. If he was still with us, he probably would have experienced a Bill Cosby kind of fall, but because he died early enough, he was able to kind of crystallize into this mythic figure. I will say, like, in hindsight, it'll be interesting to see if he remains a mythic figure in pop culture, but I guess you can never erase history. You can never erase what happened, regardless of how we feel about him now. So he does remain, of course, a superstar. As Michael Jackson was experiencing his fall, another superstar was on the rise. And that, of course, is none other than Britney Spears. Britney Spears had a very similar initiation wound to Michael Jackson. She had a childhood that was spent performing professionally. She was a Mouseketeer. She was on Broadway. She was on the talent show circuit. And her family was very unstable. She had a broken family, abuse within the family, legendary stories of her family. I encourage you to look into the history of Britney Spears' family. It's tragically sad. And she had the pressure very early on of being the breadwinner because she was a child star. She hits her peak very, very young. She is sexualized by the media at 16, so she experiences that boundary violation baked into her ascent, and she has very early attachment wounds and adultification. So very little sense of self was able to develop for her outside of performance. Her wound is very like child star eaten by the industry, which again, I want to stress, like there are many child stars that live out this story, but they're not all superstars, and Britney very much was. So Britney experiences her meteoric ascent with Baby One More Time in 1998 and becomes an instant global phenomenon. She's one of the biggest, if not the biggest pop stars on earth within a year of Baby One More Time being released. And her image, which is schoolgirl, sexy, blonde, pure, innocent, but also sexy, becomes a cultural phenomenon. So the media frenzy for Britney really does reach like Elvis, Michael Jackson status almost immediately. And by age 20, she is one of the most recognized human beings alive. So by the late 90s, early 2000, she reaches her symbol phase where she crosses over from being a mere mortal into being a cultural symbol. She is America's pop princess. She is pop perfection. And she kind of represents in the cultural imagination the battleground around these cultural anxieties about purity and sexuality and girlhood and rebellion. And then of course we reach the turning point, the public crucifixion and the fall, which for Britney does not include her death yet. question mark. Paparazzi harassment at unprecedented levels. Her breakup with Justin turns into this like media witch hunt, and she has SNL parodies and late night mockery and just constant sexualization from the media. And she then marries Kevin Federline. She has her children, experiences severe postpartum depression, has a public breakdown. And then I would say the shaving her head moment is probably the turning point for Britney Spears. It's her symbolic reclamation of her own identity, and the public responds to that moment with cruelty and not compassion. I would say this is the exact moment where Britney Spears is sacrificed to the culture. After that, she experiences a perfectly timed collapse. She goes into her conservatorship at 26, loses autonomy over her career and her finances and her children, and is reduced to basically being a legal child while still performing as a global icon. So the public kind of witnesses Britney experience something like a living death, where she is no longer in control of herself, but she is still being presented to the public as this commodity to consume. And because her tragedy never resolves, her myth continues to grow larger and larger. We then have the Free Britney movement, where she is eventually released from her chains and becomes a symbol of exploitation and abuse, but also survival and revival. It's not that death froze her in this immortal place, but really it's her captivity that freezes her as a cultural icon. And so it's maybe the first time that a superstar like dies socially, but not literally. Kind of unprecedented. And I will say, like, her story is still unfolding. Not that I am hoping that anything bad happens to her, but I would say that, like, she is a superstar still. Her story is still being told. That's how I will end the Britney Spears section. So she's kind of like this patron saint of the modern fame machine in many ways. A living ghost, if you will. And of course, as it always happens, as one superstar falls, another one rises. And I would like to end this video with the person that I think is embodying the superstar archetype currently in this present day, and that is Ariana Grande. She's raised in a wealthy family, but her parents divorced when she's 8, so she experiences that emotional displacement very young, and she also has a childhood that is spent performing professionally. She is on Broadway at a very early age, and then of course she is on Nickelodeon in the Dan Schneider universe and all that entails. So she experiences that kind of trifecta of adultification and hypersexualization and pressure to be perfect very early on. So she has trauma layered across her adolescence and her early adulthood, but she experiences Mac Miller's death and of course the Manchester bombing. So Ariana's wound is like a little bit quieter than Britney Spears, but it's just as deep, and when you look at it in a cumulative way, it's very intense. She then experiences her meteoric ascent. She has her album The Way released in 2013, and that leads to instant breakout success as a singer. And her voice becomes kind of her mythic calling card. She is framed as the new Mariah. Her music and her image becomes globally dominating very young. Her aesthetic with the ponytail and the persona is instantly iconic, and it feels very faded. It's the girl with the impossible voice becoming the era's main character kind of overnight. Ariana very quickly reaches the symbol phase with her oversized sweatshirt and her long ponytail, and she becomes kind of the symbol of Gen Z heartbreak and the idea of healing through pain. And she stops being Ariana Grande, the person, and becomes Ariana, the brand and the cultural touchpoint. And currently, her story is not over, but I would say she is on the brink of her crucifixion moments and her fall, and we're really living it out at this moment. She's currently experiencing the public kind of turning against her with her wicked romance scandal, the accusations of home wrecking throughout her career, her weight and appearance and her health are scrutinized ruthlessly. There's a lot of speculation about eating disorder. So her fall hasn't happened yet, but I think that we are in that active myth phase of it happening before our eyes. And it's very interesting to me that we're having a little bit of a full circle moment because Ariana is in Wicked, which is a story inspired by The Wizard of Oz, and that's kind of where we had our start in this video with Judy Garland. So that's just kind of spooky and woo. I don't think there is a Wicked curse. If anything, there is a superstar curse. That is what we're seeing play out both with Judy and now with Ariana. So we're going to leave it there, and I think we just want to leave with the thought that this archetype always repeats. From Jean Eagles to Valentino, Judy, Marilyn, James Dean, Elvis, Edie, Michael Jackson, Britney, and now Ariana. We are watching the same myth over and over and over. Candy Darling once said, Candy Darling was a Warhol superstar that also fits into the superstar archetype. She had a difficult childhood. Her father rejected her for being trans. She had a meteoric rise within the factory community. She became a symbol for trans women across the globe. And she had a tragic death because the hormones she was taking to transition to being a woman caused her to develop cancer, and she died tragically young. So she really lived out the superstar cycle as well. But Candy Darling once said, I am a star because I have always felt so alienated, and I project this feeling onto others. And I think that's really it at the end of the day. Superstars aren't born from perfection. They're born from fracture. The light comes from places where they were cracked open. And the world sees its own loneliness reflected in them. And that reflection is really what becomes the myth. So we are going to end it there. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. Leave a star emoji in the comments if you made it to the end of this video, so I know that you are in MVP superstar status. And let me know what you thought of this video. I think I'm gonna make this into a series. I want to tackle the it girl archetype and the rock star archetype because I think those two archetypes are similar to the superstar, but they are different in very distinct ways. So if you want to see those videos, let me know, and thank you for watching. Oh, and also subscribe to this channel. I always forget to say that. Really helps me out. So thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!